Hey everybody, it's Krissa. This is Bad at Keeping Secrets, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Elise Loehnen. She is the author of the book On Our Best Behavior, which I have here, which I was so excited that she came out with. I've known about Elise's work ever since like 2000. You'll have to correct me on the dates, when you co-hosted the Goop podcast and also the Netflix show. I remember watching you and thinking like, oh my gosh, she's so cool. I wish I knew her. And then when your book came out, I was like, oh, I want to talk to her. And then I found out you had a Substack. And then I was like, oh, I must read this. But I think something that maybe we have in common is we both, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, are seekers, trying to figure out purpose, kind of like obsessed with purpose and meaning. And like your podcast and Substack suggest, pulling at the threads of what it means to be human, what it means to be connected to society, where the truth lies. And I'm really excited that you agreed to talk to me and go through your book right now. So thank you so much for doing this.
The pleasure is all mine. And yes, I love fellow seekers. To me, it's like pulling the threads and then putting them back together. I'm a big synthesizer. I read a lot, and yeah, trying to find the commonalities, of which there are so many, of our experience, because therein, I think, lies a lot of the magic of understanding other people and ourselves. What's the context in which we find ourselves?
So I have a
And a
question for
lot of
you.
it is shared. Yeah.
To kind of start off with a kind of a grounding spot. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your early exposure to kind of this way of this inquiry, I guess you could say, or like what were you interested in as a youth, or maybe like what your parents did, or kind of
Mm-hmm.
the guides that kind of maybe primed you into
Yeah.
excited about figuring life out.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I feel like I have always been somewhat of an outsider insider. I've had access to lots of different communities, but I've always been or perceived myself as in a more observing seat than a participating seat. And that started when I was young. I grew up in Montana in a town called Missoula. And it was very beautiful, but we lived 20 minutes outside of town, probably. Handful of neighbors, but I didn't really have play dates. I had an older brother, but we had a lot of books, and we had nature, and we had horses. So nobody should feel badly for me. But I spent a lot of time as a child alone, reading and observing, and which has served me well in life. I'm very comfortable, perhaps most comfortable, being by myself, sitting at a restaurant with or without a book, is not at all intimidating to me. I just like being in the presence of other people and watching, that sounded kind of creepy, but I I don't know. I think that's my perception of myself as part of connected, yes, but also not so much belonging. I've never really belonged to a club, or like I don't know, it's just not has never been my thing. um and I grew up, I became a magazine editor. I was a magazine editor at Condé Nast for 10 years, which was a um great way to learn. I sort of came of age at the end of in that last era of amazing magazine making, when it was a really shiny and interesting place to be. This is not even pre-internet. Actually, I used to cover bloggers. I gave a lot of these prominent bloggers their first press, when it was this like, what is this world emerging? Which I've always found so fascinating. And then I ultimately worked at Goop, as you mentioned, and I've always been a behind the scenes person. I've ghostwritten 12 books. This book is my 13th book, which is a number of great meaning, culturally, and but I really liked being behind other people and helping other people tell their stories. I've liked working at brands where it's about something bigger than myself, and I it wasn't really until 2018, I think, is when we launched the Goop podcast. That was the first time that anyone would probably even know that I worked there. I'd probably spent 5 years behind the scenes, very much my preference. And but that was really exciting because for whatever reason, I thought that I would be sort of crucified by being public in any way. I had a lot of anxiety. I write about this in the chapter on pride. I think that I share this anxiety with many people, women in particular. There's not a great track record for visible women in our culture. We tend to sort of champion them and then destroy them when they reach some sort of pinnacle. When we feel like they're too big for their britches, we're very excited and eager to put them back in their place. And so I had always had a lot of anxiety about being seen and inviting that level of criticism. And when I started doing the podcast, it was very, and I think it's because it's audio, and it was really lovely. It was such a warm embrace for the most part. And then I've just slowly been sort of, I'm in my mid 40s, like been inching myself out ever since. But it took me a long time to feel comfortable. And even then, I wasn't my choice. I wasn't dying to do that. It wasn't my instinct. But it's been really great, I have to say. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Early days.
Well, I think that there was something we were talking about a little before we got on about how you feel like there's a certain amount of honesty that you're able to present. And since you are looking for kind of truth seeking, that there's a way in which that's presented in the book through the 7 deadly sins. And I was wondering if we could kind of start with a little, like a brief history of the patriarchy. It is a dense chapter, but I feel like it really is fascinating what we know, because I feel like we're learning more and more about what history might have looked like. And I think it's interesting to think about, to start questioning our behaviors and the origins of them. And I think the history lesson is a good spot to start.
Yeah. So, and one of the sort of foundational premises of the book is based on this insight from Ashley Montagu, who was an incredible anthropologist. He's the one who said we should really refer to ourselves as gatherer hunters, not hunter gatherers. And I think women inherently know this. The story is very much shaped by who is telling it. And he talks about us as having first nature and second nature. And our first nature is who we really are, which is, again, incredibly hard to access, right? And then our second nature is the story that we tell about who we are. And living in a Judeo-Christian patriarchal culture, that story is highly informed, almost exclusively informed by men. And then culture and nature get into this really fascinating Ouroboros, like just what comes first. Nature, culture. We'll never really be able to distill the two, except when we go growing up. I wasn't a history major. I was an English major, and I had just always, in some ways, assumed, I hadn't really thought about our patriarchal culture. I hadn't really thought about these systems until relatively recently, I'm ashamed to say. Not that I wasn't sort of a good feminist, but I had never thought, I didn't really understand systemic racism until the last decade. And so I hadn't really thought about patriarchy. I'd only referred to it as this, and you hear this a lot. It drives me slightly crazy because I don't think it's helpful, but people will say, like, it's the patriarchy, it's this boogeyman, right? And I, at the beginning of beginning this book project, was like, I don't even know what that is. I understand how it shows up in our lives, but where did it come from? And is it like Oz? Do you have a question?
Oh, I think you should define patriarchy.
Okay. Patriarchy is like in its origins, pater is father. So it's this male, sort of dominated male at the head structure. It could be a patriarchal family, patrilineal culture. And we live in patriarchy, where the idea is that it's led and dominated by men. And again, we don't really even know what the word means. We hear matriarchy. And I think a lot of feminists, and I understand this instinct, are like, oh, well, it used to be a matriarchy and now it's a patriarchy. Well, there's really no evidence that there was ever a matriarchy that was based on dominance and oppression led by women. There were matrilineal cultures. There's definitely way more creativity in the way that we've organized ourselves across the globe than what we see today, which has become dominant. And I think it's been presented to us as like, this is how it's always been because men are stronger, faster, they're hunting, women are gathering and hiding in caves, and like this is how we're supposed to be structured. And actually, patriarchy is not a foregone conclusion or an inevitability. We'll never completely know because we don't have written history, and we continue to go back in the past, and there are more women in the field who have slightly more expanded points of view about what this could have looked like for what it's worth, in a field that historically was dominated by men who essentially are saying like, wait, not so fast. You know, like there was a recent uncovering of a bunch of graves of warriors in the Andes.
This was really cool.
And I know 26 graves. And when they assumed they were all men, and when they actually looked at them with newer technology, 10 of the 26 were women. We now know there were female Vikings, certainly female warriors and hunters. When they look at Catalhayuk in Turkey, this is a prehistoric site that they're still studying. Men and women are effectively the same size. They ate the same food, so men were not favored. In some parts of the globe, men are favored in terms of calories. They had the same amount of soot in their lungs, so which suggests that they were spending an equal amount of time inside around fires. So you have to even wonder about the size difference that we expect between men and women. How much of that is natural and how much of that has been conditioned by culture and by like this idea that men should be dominant and women should be small. And so, yes, I wrote this chapter of how patriarchy, it gets into sort of the formation of patriarchy or our best theories about what happened, which is this idea that not rather than matrilineal, that our ancestors were affiliative partnership style cultures dependent on each other for survival. We know about the theory of alloparenting. Kids were raised communally. It makes a ton of sense. Like we're sharing resources, we're protecting each other, we're doing life together. Who really needs an organizational structure bent on hierarchy when you are surviving and just getting things done out in the world, foraging, a little planting, etc. And then it's interesting, there was this prominent female anthropologist, Maria Gimbutas, who was at UCLA, and she put forward a really grand vision of this and said that, can't remember the exact time, maybe 6,000 BC, that might be off, but that these kurgans descended from the Russian steppes, and they're called kurgan because of the way they would bury their deceased, and that they took over sort of this Indus Valley, this massive settlement of affiliative partnership style people where Judeo-Christianity essentially emerged, and that they came over and pillaged, raped, enslaved women and children. And that was the beginning of patriarchy and this idea of property and organized structure where men were on top. And she was, her theories were sort of embraced by lots of feminist writers who probably took it too far. Again, we get into this idea that it was a matriarchy taken over by men, which there's no evidence that suggests. Anyway, she was completely maligned and destroyed, Maria Gimbutas. This happened after she died, but her reputation was destroyed, even though men have been painting stories about who we are with a very broad brush forever. And only recently, DNA evidence suggests that she was very close to being completely right. I feel like the timing was slightly off, but essentially this Kurgan, primarily male group, moved in and replaced all of the DNA of that area. And then from there, originally, patriarchy didn't necessarily have a moral bent. So we have like Hammurabi's code, some of the first stellies of language, legal codes, and they're just incredibly misogynistic. It's like a woman cheats, she will be drowned, stoned and drowned. A man cheats, like he must pay her father $50. Just those sorts of pronouncements that had nothing to do with like this person's a good person or a bad person. Then we have the advent of Judeo-Christianity and a patriarchal God and monotheism. And I write about this some length, but we start to see the emergence of law and morality combining and conjoined. And then the book follows from that with this idea that women are conditioned and programmed for goodness. Again, an exterior, adjudicated from exterior. This isn't about an internal measure of goodness. I don't think anyone can deny our goodness. It's baked right into us. Whereas men are programmed and conditioned for power, which is the long hangover of patriarchy. And then we continue to sort of unconsciously, subconsciously maintain, support that in our own behavior. We police ourselves according to these ideas of what it is to be a good woman. And we police each other, unfortunately. And when I looked at what it means to be a good woman and how these map, the list that I came up with looked like the 7 deadly sins or the cardinal vices. And which was just, I had heard of them. I wasn't raised in a religious household. And I was like, there's no way. And then when I went through them, sloth, pride, envy, greed, gluttony, lust, anger, it's like, holy shit, this is a punch card. And men are not policing themselves according to these edicts at all. But this is what it means to be a good woman. And there's nothing more harmful to a woman than reputational damage. We see this all over the place, how susceptible and vulnerable we are to this. She's a bad mother. She's a bad person. She's toxic. She's cruel. She's unkind. Whereas men can do anything. They can go to jail. And as long as we perceive them as powerful, we continue to venerate them. We will tolerate any behavior from a man. But women, she doesn't have to actually do anything bad for us to assign her to the trash heap.
So this is a slight tangent, but I want to go back to 7 deadly sins after I ask you this. But I'm curious if there's like I don't know if you feel this in your own journalism ideas sort of, and what your theory on this is, ideas being in sort of the zeitgeist or the collective consciousness. But I feel like also, I don't know, a few months ago or before I found out about your book, I listened pretty religiously to No Stupid Questions with Angela Duckworth, and that she's writing a book on the 7 deadly sins. And then these sort
she
of,
is?
yeah, the cultural references just started like,
oh my God, I did not know that.
There were lots of people working, her book's not out yet, but like lots of people sort of re-examining these as a framework for in different sort of, I guess, disciplines. And I was wondering if you had thought a little bit about maybe how it's sitting, how or why we might be going to these, or what kind of
what's happening. Yeah. I think it's a major moment in the cultural, in the collective unconscious. Have you watched the Barbie movie?
I have not.
Okay. Well,
I have a young child.
Okay.
Sorry.
I get it. No. Well, the Barbie movie, it's from what I know, we were Greta Gerwig, Noah Bauman, what's his name? Her husband. We were all writing we were all writing concurrently. And Barbie is almost, it's wild. This America Ferrera monologue that's going around the internet essentially maps to honor best behavior. We're clearly sort of like tapping into the same collective unconscious. And then the way that the Barbies are deprogrammed once Ken decides to bring patriarchy to Barbie land is by pointing out the cognitive dissonance between sort of who we're told that we are and who we actually are. And so it's kind of, it was a wild experience. And so many people were texting me being like, have you seen this? Like, this is your book in Mattel form. So I'm not surprised. I'm delighted Angela Duckworth is dipping into these too. The Barbie doesn't connect it to the 7 deadly sins, but when you actually go through the monologue, they're all present. And it's this idea that a good woman is tireless, has no need for rest, has no appetites or desires or wants, and never gets upset, that she's thin but healthy. All of this cultural conditioning, which I think, you know, my book, it's funny, there's nothing inherently original about it. I am just identifying all of these conversations, all of these moments of cognitive dissonance that we have, and then all the incredible scholarship that looks at them in silos. Like, what is it about women and anger? What is it about women and food? What is it about women and the pay gap and the wealth gap? So my effort was to bring them all into the same house and say, this is the system. This is why this has such a hold on us. It's not enough for me to be like, I'll be angry. I don't care if people are going to call me a bitch, a nag, a shrew, a hysterical, shrieking woman. One, it's part of a larger system that has us bound. But two, the only way that we start to unwind this is by being conscious of how it has us in its thrall, and then do the work collectively to disentangle these stories and say, actually, I refuse that. I don't care whether you think I'm quote unquote good. I refuse to participate in this anymore. And by practicing or modeling my freedom, I make you free as well.
So I would love it if you would be willing to kind of talk, starting with sloth, talk maybe like a few antidotes for each of the sins and how they sort of create these, put us in a bind, I guess you could say, or separate us from our authentic or true selves.
Yeah. So sloth is like the most accessible by far, I think, to any woman. I don't know any woman who would qualify as being lazy. There's this idea that that there's always more to be done, and that a good woman is doing for others all the time, subjugating her wants to other people's needs, and so on and so forth. And that the work of a good mother is endless. The work of a good employee is equally endless. And then the two just sort of in this quest for quote unquote balance, it's not about taking things off. It's like we're just ratcheting up the pressure on ourselves. And then you get into the cycle of shaming of like, if for women who work exclusively out of the home, projecting their own feelings of badness onto women who work outside of the home and vice versa, right? It's this terrible cycle that sucks for all of us. And so sloth, I mean, and there are a million, I wrote that chapter like 3 times the length and then just had to cut and cut and cut stories. But it was this idea, you know, the most persistent idea being my husband saying to me, you know, since we've been married, you've never sat on the couch with me for more than 20 minutes and watched a show or movie without doing something else. And it's like, well, yeah, of course not. I mean, I have this invisible cattle prod at my butt and I am up to get my computer. I'm multitasking. Then I'm in the kitchen, like loading some dishes. Then I'm like moving the laundry. And for a long time, I sort of had this rage at him of like, this is all on me. I have to do everything, you know. For one, I wasn't really leaving him space or time to actually assume any of this. There's a lot of learned helplessness. But I also recognize like he's not asking me to do any of this. It's not like he's not at no one is saying to me, your house needs to be perfect. You need to have like nutritious home cooked meals on the table every night. You need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is all my own internal programming, my own self-flagellation, my own drive to prove to someone somewhere that I'm a good enough mother, that I'm a good enough partner, etc. And so for me, it was this awareness of like, holy shit, I'm doing this to myself. And I am the only one who can stop this. And trying to stop it was so uncomfortable. I haven't done it successfully, but like the amount of agitation it brings up, my instinct, and I don't think I'm alone, is to sort of busy over all my feelings of not enoughness by doing stuff all the time. And I see this in all the women I know. There's always more to be done. And the doing keeps all the bad feelings at bay.
What can you just illustrate a little bit about what the sort of pushback against this busyness looks like?
Like how you practice it in yourself?
Yeah, or like what have you, so now that you've like recognized this idea or this sort of coping skill of being busy to fulfill several things that you're supposed to be, how do you, beyond like recognizing its existence, is there a way that you personally are working or shifting your mindset to kind of maybe take back a little bit of that sort of, or pull back the sort of, what do you paddle?
So yeah, it's hard. So first of all, like this work ideally is communal, and we sort of give each other collective relief, because I think there's this reinforcing cycle, particularly with social media, where you're like, oh, I'm not doing that, or like, oh, like my house doesn't look like that. I think it's only ratcheted up the pressure that we feel in terms of performing our lives publicly. So I think that that's this communal part. It's really hard to be the one who's deviant. I write about going to this woman's house in my neighborhood. This is at the beginning of COVID. It's only moms concerned about our kids and their programming, and like gathering to try to figure out if there's anything that we can do. And I remember going to her house. She was running a business with a friend. And her house was just this spectacular disaster. And she had hired someone to sort of like help her. They'd been away, I can't remember, to deep clean and help her. And the woman was like, okay, I'm going to go to the store and get supplies. And she was like, great. And then the woman texted her and was like, I'm not coming back. So she's telling us the story and acknowledging just like that her house is like out of control and she doesn't know how to clean it. And her husband comes out to say hi. He's in his pajamas. This woman's fully dressed, but I just had so much judgment, so much like, how is this possible? Like, how can this woman exist like this? And so, one, it was just like watching myself and then being like, all right, that's unacceptable. That I at no point am holding her husband, who seems to be slobbier than her, responsible for any of this. It was just interesting. One, like, so observing yourself and observing your thoughts can be incredibly clarifying, because I was like, this is wild to actually have this experience of her, watch myself judging her. I'm like, what is it to her? She doesn't actually really care. She's sort of like making a joke about it, but she doesn't care enough to actually, yeah, what, you know, this is me judging her. And then this happened after my book went to press, but last summer I got an amazing lesson in this. I fell off a horse and I broke my neck, and I was fine, but I was in a brace for a week. I didn't know my neck was broken for a week, and I proceeded to pack. We were away, pack my family. I didn't lift any heavy bags because I was in so much pain, but I was like trying like a broken robot to just keep doing stuff. And then when I got home and the doctor was like, you need to just, you can't drive, do not lift anything more than like 3 pounds. Sit, you're going to sit and be immobilized for a month. And just the anxiety that came up for me, this like, I need to unpack and do all this laundry. I need to take care of my kids. I need to make beds, and to be like, I can't do it. So first of all, it's like my husband miraculously did a lot because there was room for him to do stuff. And two, I just had to sit. I had to stew in my own discomfort, because how I prove my value to myself and to the world is in the amount that I achieve and the amount that I do for everyone. And I couldn't do anything. And it was just so uncomfortable, but such a good learning experience for me to just not actually be able to do anything about the discomfort without threat of, I don't know, paralyzing myself. I mean, I wasn't going to paralyze myself if I did laundry, but like, couldn't do anything. And it was wild. And I can't say I'm perfect, but I'm now much more conscious, because one of the arguments that I make about in the book is that because we're so attuned to trying to be good, when feelings that come up in us that we perceive as bad, we don't even let them come up. We just suppress, repress, shove them down, refuse them, project them onto other people potentially. But we're not conscious of what's actually happening in our bodies.
Let's talk, can we pause really quick on suppression and the suppression of emotions, and how,
Yeah.
what you know about the history of that and how that plays into this whole system, and then what we actually know, what the science says about how emotions work.
Yeah. So I think, well, it's interesting, right? Because it's funny, I was just reading, or looking back at John Sarno's book, The Mind Body Prescription, because I was talking to this woman who's a therapist, Nicole Sachs, and she has a whole, she was like, your book is exactly, he was her mentor. And so his argument is that he was a doctor who cured thousands and thousands and thousands of people of intractable back pain, because by just one revelation, one point, all of this repressed emotion, primarily repressed rage that could be carried over from childhood. Essentially, there's just a finite amount of unprocessed emotion that any of us can carry before we start breaking. And that it becomes so overwhelming to the unconscious that it's suppressed and then shows up in other symptoms to distract us from tending to the pain of our feelings. And I think women understand this intimately. And I think in time, when we think about autoimmune diseases, which are essentially the self turning on the self, there has to be a significant emotional component to this. We know how powerful our minds are. We know how powerful the placebo is. It's the standard by which every drug has to beat the placebo. It's very hard. And we think about placebo as like for suckers, right? Oh, you're so duped. But the point is, like, our minds, our emotions, like, run the show. We're so powerful. And it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of our strength that we can dictate sort of our health. And I think we're at the very beginning of understanding this, but the way that we're conditioned to just sort of stuff it, to stuff our anger, because to express our anger might require relational loss, might require being cast out. Socially, we despise angry women. It's completely acceptable for a man to be unhinged in public. We kind of respect it, this level of aggression from a man. But women, no way. We have all sorts of terrible words for these women. But we have to learn how to let all of these bad feelings come up so that we can diagnose them, feel them. What's amazing is that when you actually let them come up, they can move really quickly through you. They're quite full of motion. They're not life-ending. And it's so much better than projecting them onto other people or onto yourself.
I mean, I think that that's like I think what I was subconsciously trained to do, and I'm now as an adult looking back to like how the programming through family and how our family structure kind of addressed these emotions. But when you talk about suppression, and we're really running out of time, of emotions, something that I wanted to, I think if I'm going to pick like two more of, even though I wanted to do all of them, something that I really repressed until like very like maybe in the last 10 years was envy. And I was wondering, something that I feel like to admit that you were jealous of someone was like, ew, you are jealous. Gross. How could you feel that? And
Gross.
I don't, that's just like you're like a bad person. I was wondering if you could kind of unpack
Yes.
envy as a sin. and
Yes.
recontextualize it as maybe information or cues, I guess.
Yes. So this chapter, it's interesting because my editor had such an aversion to this chapter. I wrote it as the first chapter and she was like, I refuse to believe this. I don't have any envy. I love women. All women are great, you know? And then ultimately, just by thinking about it, she started to identify her envy. So here's the thing about envy. It feels disgusting and gross. And most of us would never acknowledge that we have it. And envy and jealousy are different. Jealousy is usually involves a third, like a triangulation in a relationship, whereas envy is direct and intimate and one-to-one. You want something that someone else has. You want someone or something that someone else has. That's envy. And I was talking to psychotherapist Lori Gottlieb. I was interviewing her for the Good podcast. This is probably 5 years ago. And there was a small aside, and maybe you should talk to someone, where she says that she tells her clients to pay attention to their envy because it tells them what they want. And I, this was such a revelation for me because I think, like you, I was like, I don't have any envy. I would never have any envy. And when she said that, I was like, wow, I don't have any envy. Wait, but if I had envy because someone else has what I want, would I even be able to identify the envy? I don't think so, because I think that what women do, my theory, which I think has been proven out in the reception of the book and the conversations I've had, is that my instinct, because I have been trained to subjugate all of my wants to other people's needs, is to not know what I want and to not even recognize it when I see it in another woman. And instead, I suppress it, repress it, and then project. And I see someone who has something I want, and my instinct is, I just don't like her. She rubs me the wrong way. Who does she think she is? Why does she think that she can do that? I would never allow myself to do or have that. And so I think we get into this like woman on woman hate. And I think the cause of a lot of it is undiagnosed envy. That instead we should say, why is this woman bothering me? Like, why is she irritating me, tormenting me? Tormentor, as Richard Schwartz says. She's giving you really important information. She is shining a light on a dream that you have for yourself that you are not owning. And it might be a big dream. It might be, oh, I would like to have a podcast, or I would like to have a successful newsletter, or I would like to write a book, and I'm not owning that. Or it might be, she takes really good care of her health and I'm envious, or she has really well-behaved children and I'm envious. Whatever it may be, it could be small, it could be big, but she's full of information. The people who are not full of information, like, do not bother us. And I will say, I want to make the distinction that when you think of someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, for me, there's a lot of stuff that she does that I find hateful and cruel. But I can identify that behavior and say, like, not today, not okay with this, I do not like this. No, I don't have any like actual personal agitation about Marjorie Taylor Greene, if that makes sense. So that's sort of the distinction. You can either identify the behavior that you find problematic. I'm not suggesting that we should like everything that every woman does. I think we're sort of gaslit into believing that we should, that it's anti-woman to not be fully on board. But there's a distinction between not liking someone for nebulous reasons and not liking their behavior.
I got into the biggest fight with my sister last weekend over Kanye West's ex-wife, Kim Kardashian.
Yeah.
And her definition of self, I don't know why my words are not, that she was self-made, if that makes sense.
Oh, right.
Or that, and it turned out that like my sister is an influencer in Los Angeles and felt like in my saying that I was taking away somehow some of her merit by saying that she wasn't self-made. That was somehow indirectly taking away my sister's merit by making the statement, if that makes sense. And I feel like this is similar in a way that like there was it was a weird metaphor for like credit and envy, because she was saying I was anti-feminist for saying that Kim Kardashian wasn't self-made. And it was just I don't know why I'm bringing it
It's
up.
like such a funny, no, but it's funny. Men are very quick to proclaim that they are self-made. I think women inherently are like, that is a fallacy. There is no such thing as someone who is self-made. Kim Kardashian, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, right? I think now we're starting to understand the aligning factors of both privilege and access to capital and access to mentors and resources, plus like all the incredible amounts of help that they received along their way. Like there is no such thing as a self-made person. Yes, Kim Kardashian, it's hard to create however many billions of dollars worth of market value her brand has. That's not a foregone conclusion. It's not a foregone conclusion that anyone could have as much fame or resonance and culture. So she deserves a lot of credit, certainly. It's like she's a phenomenon in that way, but she didn't like crawl out from under a rock and then do this all on her own. She also has like Skims. She is an incredible business partner, you know? I could go on and on. And it doesn't disparage anything that she's created or that she's been able to the success that she's been able to generate for herself. But nobody is self-made. Nobody.
I mean, I agree with you. I think I think I'm just not, I wasn't willing to go to bat for, I wasn't
For
going to make the
Kim.
argument that Kim Kardashian has somehow worked harder or is more deserving of her
No,
fame and
no,
wealth than any other
that's
person.
correct. No, she's very, very
Um,
lucky and alive at a certain time and like probably
yeah,
has some sort of like weird spiritual mandate. I mean, we could get really woo woo about like who Kim Kardashian is in the culture and why, but no, she doesn't. It's a confluence of so many different factors, of
yeah,
course.
no, it's crazy to think about all of the sort of controls and all of the variables in the
Yeah,
situation that had to like come together just so she could be in our minds at the same moment right now.
yeah.
It's baffling. So we are totally out of time and we didn't cover like half of maybe
We'll do
three-fourths
it again
of
anytime. This was really fun. I'll
my
do it.
question.
100% do it again if you ever want to.
Well, I do want to tell you, I do want to touch base in conclusion, kind of with kind of wrapping our heads around this sort of aim at realignment and redefinition of goodness. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit about what that means about holding. I think you talk about, you end with kind of almost it's like a loving kindness meditation, or
Yeah.
and I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about your goal and your sort of why
Yeah.
stop there. And I it's such a
Yeah.
sweet ending, and I feel like I bookmarked it because I want to like go back to it every day and have that sort of start my day, that intention.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I could have written sort of like a book that was all about like, let's embrace our lust and our gluttony and our greed, et cetera. And it's not that book. It's about reconciliation and balance and letting all of these very human emotions, instincts, and drives emerge so that we can achieve wholeness. Carl Jung has this great quote: I'd rather be whole than good. And I would put good in parentheses because, again, like this book is about how our the ideas of goodness are this cultural creation by men that's then assigned to us. This is about, judges, juries, professors, teachers, parents telling us what qualifies as good or not. This is not about the internal idea of goodness. The fact that goodness, I think, is baked into all of us and that we are all shadow and light. Both of those things are prevalent. We have good days and bad days. We have good moods and bad moods. And I think that women have been taught to deny those parts of ourselves that offer us wholeness and that are a part of this entire experience. And so that's really what I am offering is like, when you let all of these ideas of badness come up, you'll recognize they're really not so bad at all. This is what it is to be human.
Thank you so much, Elise, for doing this. I really,
Oh,
really
my pleasure.
appreciate your time. I'm going to put links to the book and to your Substack and also your podcast, Pulling the Thread. And this book does not disappoint 100%.
Thank you.
Thank you.